On this video, I thought it would be helpful, and many have asked me to do this, or a number of people, just to give the different views among Bible believing Christians, we could say among evangelicals, concerning the second coming of Jesus Christ. First of all, let me say that all strong Bible believers who are Christians believe in a literal second coming of Christ. That everyone agrees with. Where they differ is in terms of the order of events. And what I'd like to do is do a very brief summary of the different positions for anyone that might be listening. Let me begin by saying the first position is what we might call the pre-tribulational, dispensational, and premillennial point of view. What that means is Christ is coming back before a 7-year tribulation period and also before the millennium. And he will come to bring the church to meet him in the air. Those who hold this position teach that Israel and the church are two different ways that God is dealing in history with his theological program. It starts out with Israel, followed then by the church, which starts in Acts 2 and concludes in 1 Thessalonians 4 at the coming of Christ. And then the tribulation period follows while the church believers are in heaven. And this is then after that period of time, 7-year tribulation, which goes back to Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks of Daniel. The last 7-year period is applied by dispensational and premillennial theologians to look at the tribulation period. And it picks up Israel's program, it is taught, and the church is raptured before that, and then returns with Christ at the end of the tribulation period. So this has been popularized by the Left Behind series, and many evangelical churches hold to this view. Many Baptist churches, as well as other denominations, acknowledge this view. The view seems to have developed, it is argued, in the late 1800s. It comes out, many believe, of the Plymouth Brethren Circle in England under a man named Darby and his influence. In this view, it is taught that Christ will take the church and rapture the church out before the 7-year tribulation period. The book of Revelation looks at that period. It is taught from chapter 6 through chapter 18 with the return of Christ, in 19 at the end of the tribulation period. It is also taught that the temple of Ezekiel is literally restored with sacrifices that are viewed as memorial during a period called the millennium, the 1,000-year millennium. So in this viewpoint, those who hold to this believe in two phases of Christ's coming. One before the tribulation period to rapture the church, to meet him and take it out of the world. And then the tribulation period for 7 years, followed by the church coming back with Christ to the earth, where Christ reigns for 1,000 years in a millennium. And that's why it is premillennial as well. The second viewpoint is what we might call the historic premillennial viewpoint. This viewpoint was believed and supported by several church fathers. It is taught that the church goes through the tribulation period, is not raptured out of it, then Christ comes to reign after the millennium, and he reigns during the millennium. And the church is caught up to meet him at that point, and he reigns for 1,000 years. Believers in the church and believers during the tribulation period reign with him. And so this viewpoint allows what we call two phases of Christ's return, one pre-tribulational and one post-tribulational, and believers are resurrected then to reign with Christ on earth in Jerusalem, and the rapture becomes like a welcoming party, welcoming Christ at his second advent. Most who hold this view believe in a rebuilt literal temple with what we call memorial sacrifices. Some, however, do not believe in a rebuilt temple, but believe that the temple of Ezekiel is to be understood in a more spiritual idea of idealized worship. It's like describing what idealized worship would look like using temple worship as an illustration or imagery of that. The difficulty in this view is that there must, people argue, be two resurrections, one at the beginning of the millennium and one at the end, for those who pass into the millennium and die and must be resurrected, along with those who are resurrected premillennially, so to speak. Then we have the post-millennial position. In this position, believers in the church have argued that the church will bring in the millennium, followed by Christ's return. In this position, there's only one judgment for believers and non-believers, and that judgment takes place at the end of the millennium. And the millennium, probably according to this position, follows Augustine in a sense. That is, that Christ is reigning now with the martyrs who Revelation talks about. And Charles Hodge at Princeton years ago argues for this position, and Christ then returns after the church, by its progress and what it does, brings in, quote, the millennium, the final, let's say, phase of the millennium when Christ returns and there's a new heaven and new earth. Then we have what is called the amillennial viewpoint. Amillennial means no millennium or without millennium. Augustine argued that the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 was a symbol of the millennium that is going on now. So he taught that the martyrs of Revelation 20 are reigning now with Christ. And the idea of that viewpoint is called amillennialism. It is a present reign from the ascension of Christ to the second advent or second coming. At the end of this reign, it is argued Christ will return to judge. And there's only one judgment, and that's the judgment of believers and non-believers. By the way, in the dispensational premillennial point of view, there's several judgments. The church is raptured out, and there is a judgment in heaven for their works at the judgment seat of Christ. Then they return, and the ones that are being judged in that position are the non-believers. Where with this viewpoint, Christ will come to judge in only one judgment. Satan is bound during the reign, and there's a big debate about that. Some believe he's bound at the end of a literal millennium. This position believes that he is bound today in one sense. I mean, he's still alive and well, but bound, those who hold to this position, in that nations will have believers in all nations coming out of the Great Commission. And Satan was not able to stop that from happening. Church reformers, like, as I understand, Luther and Calvin, were all amillennial. And many, what we call Reformed theologians, going back to the Reformation and going back to Luther and Calvin, are also amillennial today. With this view, there is no earthly millennium. There is the tribulation period only. There is one return of Christ, followed then by the general resurrection and judgment, which will usher in a new heaven and new earth. So there'll be one final, only one final coming, and the rapture is like the welcoming party at the end of time. And there's one general resurrection, a bodily resurrection of all at once, including both believers and non-believers. And this would be the great white throne judgment, the judgment of the sheep and the goats, the judgment of the wheat and the tares. So amillennialists argue that no New Testament scripture points to a premillennial idea except Revelation 20, where the martyrs reign with Christ for 1,000 years. And those who hold this viewpoint believe that that is happening now in a spiritual reign, and that they would argue that Matthew 13 talks about the wheat and the tares being separated at the final harvest time, and the sheep and the goats of Matthew 25 being the same judgment, and where Jesus said, all who sleep in the dust will arise, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting judgment. So those are the basic positions. I wanted to just state them for anyone that might want to think about them. And the passages that one would read are 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, John chapter 14, which talk about going to be with the Lord. And then we have the other passages that would be 2 Thessalonians 2, where two things have to happen before the Lord comes back. There needs to be the great falling away, the Antichrist, and Christ's return. And then not only do we have Matthew 24 as key, looking at the return of Christ, which amillennialists apply to that one general coming, where premillennialists will do what we call a bringing two ideas together in one. It's sort of like the first coming of Christ sounds like the first and second are together sometimes when you read the prophets. So they'll speak of it as telescoping. That is Matthew 24 and 25, where amillennial interpreters believe that this is showing one general coming, wheat and tares separated, sheep and goats, applying to the great white throne judgment, and the judgment seat of Christ being the same. And the things that precede it would be the great falling away, the Antichrist, the man of sin, and the return of Christ. So those are the basic positions, and the passages to read would be Daniel 9, which talks about the 70th week of Daniel, applied to that 7-year tribulation period, which premillennialists say is yet futuristic. Amillennialists say it already happened in the time of Christ's first coming. And then along with that, we have Matthew 24 and 25, key passage that is discussed about the coming of Christ and the final judgment and the sheep and the goats of Matthew 25. And then 1 Thessalonians 4, the dead in Christ shall rise, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up. That is often equated with John 14, applied to the rapture. Some take that to be, as we said, prior to a tribulation period from Daniel 9, the 70th week of Daniel. Others believe it's after that period of time. And then the millennium is debated in this sense. Some take it as a very literal millennium on earth, not necessarily a literal 1,000 years, but a literal earthly reign, where others feel, like Augustine, that the martyrs who are to reign during that period are already reigning with Christ in heaven. This is Augustine's viewpoint from the first coming of Christ and his resurrection to the second coming. So these are some key passages, and I've tried to just sort of summarize it. Another key passage is 1 Corinthians 15, which mainly talks about victory over death and could be applied to any of these positions. So I hope this is helpful. It's a quick resume, a quick summary, and my wife has encouraged me to just share it. And whatever position you come to, the good news is they all agree in the fact that Christ is coming again. And it's a literal coming, not a spiritual coming that doesn't happen, but a literal return where he will reign and he will be the final King of Kings and Lord of Lords in the ultimate new heaven and new earth. However, one applies the particulars leading up to that great coming.
That's